This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning, Rabbi. So today we have a little bit of a different venue. We're going to learn a little bit Parshas Chukas. We're going to learn an episode from the end of the Parsha, which is not so focused on. It's about when Klal Yisrael was traveling through the land of Moav, about to enter Eretz Yisrael. And the psukim that discuss this incident are a little bit unusual. Some of the word terminology is a little bit unusual. The pasuk says in Parak Chaf Aleph, pasuk Yudalad, Al Kein Yeomar. Therefore, it will be said, B'Sefer Milchamois Hashem, in the book of the wars of Hashem, Es Vahev B'Sufa. The word Vahev is also a very difficult word, because the opinion of Rashi is that no word in Hebrew ever begins its root with the letter Vav. Vav is always an add-on, and. Rashi's opinion is there's no root word that begins with the letter Vav, except for the word Vav. Vavim. A Vav is a hook. The reason why that word could begin with the letter Vav is because the word, the concept, looks like the letter Vav. A hook looks like a Vav. But other than that, no word begins with a Vav. So it's an unusual word. Es vahev b'sufa, that which is given in the end. Ve'es hanecholim Arnon, and the rivers of Arnon. Ve'eshed hanecholim, and the pouring of the rivers. Asher nata l'sheves are, which inclined and tilted to the residents of Ar, Vinishan, and leaned l'gvul Moav, to the border of Moav. So what's happening over here? Says Rashi, Ve'eshed hanecholim. Rashi learns the word eshed is not a Hebrew word. Rashi learns the word eshed means pouring. Targum shel shefech eshed. The targum of the word pouring is eshed. So therefore this word eshed is actually an Aramaic word. Shefach hanecholim, the pouring of the river. Shenishbach sham dam Amorim. The blood of the Amorites were spilled there. Shahayu nechvaim sham. The Amorites hid there. They hid there. Why? What's the story? Lefi shahayu haharim gvayim. There were two tall mountains. Vehanachal amoik, and the valley was deep. The cuts are in short. Vehaharim smuchim zalazeh, and the mountains were close to each other. Adam oimed al har mizeh, a man could stand on one mountain, umedarim chaver bahar mizeh, and speak to his friend on the other mountain. Vehaderech oiver b'soich hanachal, and the road passed between the valley. In other words, you basically had two mountains which were in very close proximity to each other. They were mamish next to each other. These two mountains are next to each other. So you could have one guy over here, one guy over here. They could be talking to each other. They could even say Shalom Aleichem, extend their hand. In between the two mountains, there's a very narrow, deep bypass. Well, says Rashi, Amru Amorim, the Amirim said, you know what? We know the Jews are going to have to pass through the valley. What we're going to do is we're going to hide in the clefts of the rock, of the mountain. We're going to hide in the caves in the mountain. And as they're coming by, we're going to dump and drop and throw stones at them and kill them. Amru Amarim, the Amarim said, when the Jews pass through the valley, Lavor la'aretz, to go through the land, Neitzei min ha'aretz, let's go out of the caves, Shebaharim, in the mountains, Shalmal mehem, above them, Benahargim, let's kill them, Bechitzim, with arrows, Va'avnei bilisterois, and catapult stones. V'hayu oisan hanekoim bahar shel tzad Moav. So the mountain, one mountain was on the side of Moav, one mountain was the side of Amori, Eretz Yisrael. So Rashi tells us like this. V'hayu oisan hanekoim bahar shel tzad Moav. The holes in the wall, the holes in the mountain were on Moav's side. So on the Moav mountain there were indentations. Uvahar shel tzad Amorim, and the mountain of the Amorites, Hayu Keneged Oisam Nikaim, opposite to those holes, Kamei Kronos Vishadayim, were like horns, or the chest of a woman, bolt in lachutz, that protrude outwardly. So basically, you had caves on the Moab side, and horns protruding in a way where if the mountains would merely go together, they would fit together like a puzzle. Okay? So, what happened? Kivan Shabbat Yisrael Avar, when Klal Yisrael was about to cross, Nizdazeya hahar shel Eretz Yisrael, the mountain of Eretz Yisrael trembled, kishivcha hayotzes lahakbel pnei gevirta, like a maidservant that goes out to greet her mistress. Basically, the mountain of Eretz Yisrael went out toward the mountain of Moav, v'niskarv l'tzad hahar shel Moav, v'nichnasu oisan hashadayim, and those protrusions went out, l'toichos, and to come into the clefts, v'hargum, and they murdered the Amorim who were hiding in the holes. V'zehu, this is the meaning, asher nota l'shaves ar, that it was leaning to the inhabitants of Ar, shehahar nota v'makaymai, the mountain moved from its place, v'neskarev l'tzad Moav, and it came close to the side of Moav, v'nidbak bay, and it clung to it. V'zehu, and this is the meaning of v'nishan l'gvul Moav. This is the meaning of, and it leaned to the border of Moav, and Klal Yisrael passed over the mountain, because there's no bypass anymore. And Klal Yisrael did not even know about this miracle that Hashem performed until a river went through that area between the mountains, and blood started coming out, and only then Klal Yisrael discovered the miracle that Hashem brought for them. So interesting, in this pasuk, Al Kain Ye'amar, therefore it will be said, B'Sefer Milchamois Hashem, in the book of wars of God, Es Vahev B'Sufa, that which was given in the Yamsuf, the way you touch that is like this. As Vahev B'Sufa, that which was delivered at Yamsuf, V'es Hanecholam Arnon, and the valley of the Arnon. Meaning, one day it will be written in the book of the wars of God, the same way that Hashem made a miracle at the Yamsuf, Vahev B'Sufa, it will also be related what happened at the valley of Arnon. That's a simple meaning. In other words, this pasuk is talking about the war that God waged against the Amorim. And yet, if you look in the Gemara in Kedushin, on Daf Lamed Amud Beis, it's number 3 on your sheets, the Gemara says, Amar Reb Chia bar Abba, Reb Chia bar Abba said, Afilu ha'av uvenoi, even a father and his son, harav v'talmidoi, a Rebbe and his student, sha'oiskim b'Torah, b'shar echad, even if they are oisek in Torah one gate, nasim oivim zalzeh. At first they become enemies. When two people learn, a father and a student, a Rebbe and a Talmud, at first they're becoming enemies. They're arguing vehemently, they're discussing, they're fighting, and then they're at each other's throats. One person doesn't accept the argument of the other, and vice versa. Rashi says, mitoich shemak shem zelazeh, because they ask one another, ve'ein zeh mekabel devrei zeh, and one does not accept the argument of the other. But Ad shenasim oihavim zeh. In the end, they become friends. They love each other. Shenemar es vahev besufa. Now we're darshaning al tikri besufa. Don't read it yamsuf ela besoifa. In the end, vahev is a lashon not of giving, but rather love. So in other words, you read the pasuk like this, according to the Gemara. Al ken yamar. Therefore, will be said besefer milchamois Hashem. Then when it comes to waging God's war, what war is God's war? The war of Torah. Then, as Vahev B'Sufa, there'll be love in the end. That even though at first the people are fighting and they're arguing and they're at each other's throats and there's real Milchamta Shel Torah, in the end there's Ahava. So it comes out then that the simple reading of the pasuk according to Rashi is very different than the Drush of the Gemara. The way we read the pasuk according to Rashi is that one day it will be said in the book of the wars of God, that just like Hashem destroyed our enemies at the Yamsuf, He destroyed our enemies in the Nachal Arnon. Another pshat is, according to the Gemara in Kedushin, that when people fight in learning, there's love in the end. So two almost opposite pshatim in one pasuk. One level of understanding is this is talking about a literal war that we averted against the Amorim, and the other pshat is this is talking about the war of Torah that ends in a friendly manner. So the question is, how do you put these two pshatim together? Do they fit together? Do they work together? So, in fact, they do very much. The pasuk says in Tehillim, LeDavid, in Parak Lamed Hey, by David, Riva Hashem es Yerivai, God, take up my cause, Lecham es Lechamai, fight my wars. So the Medrash asks, could an Eved, a Basar Badam, ask his master to fight his wars? You know, I'll stay home and you go out and fight my wars. Imagine if you have a soldier, and the soldier says to the king, King, you know, I'm taking the day off, you go fight the war for me. Never such a thing happened. So how do we understand this passage? So we understand like this. It says the Medrash, V'chein Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu David, David, Asoik b'Torah v'ani elchaim milcham moisecha. This is how it works. You just learn, and I'll fight your wars. V'chein Amar Moshe. Moshe said the following: Al kain ye'amar b'sefer milchamois Hashem. Therefore, it will be said in the book of the words of Hashem, like this: Im atem oiskem ba'sefer, ani nilcham al yedechem. If you are involved in learning, I will fight your wars. In other words, this medrash now, according to this medrash, the medrash is reading the pasuk a third way. Al ken yomar b'sefer. That when Klal Yisrael is involved in the sefer, then Hashem says, if you're involved in learning, milchamois Hashem, I'll fight your war for you. So I once heard from Rav Noach Isaac Goldbaum, Shlita, that according to this medrash, the two pshatim fit in beautifully. The pshat that this refers to the war of the Amorim, and the pshat that when a person learns, we become oyavim zelazeh. These two pshatim work out beautifully and harmoniously, and they bring to the third pshat. In other words, when we learn the pasuk, the way the Gemara in Kedushin learns the pasuk, that it's referring to people who are learning, then that's when we're zoiche that Hashem will fight the Amorim for us. In other words, like it says in the Medrash Tehillim. The way the Gemara in Kedushin learns, that when the Gemara in Kedushin learns this pasuk referring to Limud HaTorah. Rashi learns it referring to a war against Amorim. But they're not a stira. Because look at this war against Amorim. We didn't have to lift up a knife. We didn't have to lift up bow and arrow. We didn't have to do anything. The Rebbe Hashem completely waged the war for us. When we're involved in Sefer, Hashem fights our wars for us. So let's just explain this concept a little bit. A very amazing yesod that the Gemara says at the end of Brachos. Amar Rabbi Laza, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. The Torah sages make peace in the world. So, you could say one pshat like we learned, we said Shal Shudas yesterday, and also we learned on Friday, you could see the Shiur, that we explained from the Malbim, Vayikach Kairach, that really, the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, that it doesn't say the Machlokes of Kairach and Moshe was Shaloi L'Shem Shemaim. It says Kairach V'Adasai. Because the Malbim explains, the Machlokes really was between Kairach V'Adasai. Kairach wanted to be Kohen Gadol. So did the Bnei Ruvain, because they held the Bechor and the Kuna was taken away from them. So the truth is, they themselves cannot get along. But they both had one thing in common. They didn't like Moshe Rabbeinu. So we wanted to suggest, what's Pshat Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam? Because without Talmidei Chachamim, everybody would fighting amongst themselves. Once you have a Talmid Chacham, everybody could get along. The common goal is, they don't like the Talmid Chacham. That's just, like we find by Korach V'Adasai. Korach didn't like Dasan Aviram. Dasan Aviram didn't like the 250 men. They couldn't stand each other. One thing they all agreed on is they didn't like Moshe Rabbeinu. So Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. That's just, it's serious, but it's also a joke at the same time. But the Chasam Sofer has a wondrous pshat. What's pshat in Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam? Chasam Sofer says like this in his drashos. There's a malach in Shamayim that's appointed over warfare. This malach cannot be silenced. He has to do his job. He will always make war. Come the Talmidei Chachamim and they say, okay, of course there has to be war. We will fulfill the quota of war with Melchamta Shel Torah. We'll fight about Rashi, we'll fight about Tosfos, we'll fight about the Gemara. We'll wage so much war that now, basically the Malacha is capped out. He's maxed out. He doesn't need to bring war to the world. Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. Talmidei Chachamim create peace in the world. Why? Because they use up the quota of war for Melchamta Shel Torah. Now there's no more war necessary for the rest of the world. Says the Chasam Sofer, take a look at number 8. The Chasam Sofer says in his drashos, it's impossible for the world to be lacking the work of one minister, one officer, one malach in Shemayim. Ella shala asilavai yishapech hakol toiv. But rather, in the future, everything will be turned to good. V'hinei saroi shel Edom hamemuna ala machloikes. The malach of Edom that's appointed over arguments. L'chsheyiyah shalom ba'olam emertz Hashem. La'asilava, when there's peace in the world, la'yimtza shum makoim. The malach appointed over machlokes will find no place in the world. Ella al yedei pilpul ha'Torah. The only war that he'll be able to employ is the arguments of Torah. Hanirim ka'oivim bashar, who when people learn Torah at first they appear like enemies. Umisham hachi talmidei chachamim marbim shalom ba'olam. That's why the Torah sages increase war in the world, because through the machlokes of Torah there could be peace. Says the Chasam Sofer, this is the meaning of Hakoil Kol Yaakov, the Hayadayim Yidei Esav. Literally, the pasuk means, Yitzchak says, you sound like Yaakov, but you feel like Esav. We also have a tradition that it means that Kishakol Yaakov Mitzavtzafim Beveis HaMedrash, when the voice of Yaakov is heard, Ein Yedei Esav Shaltais. The hands of Esav do not reign. In other words, when we use the Kol Yaakov, the Yedei Esav is not effective. Chasam Sofer explains it like this. When a person learns, and he's really involved, and he's really arguing, he's not just doing it with his mouth. His hands are involved, right? You know, he's motioning, he's moving his hands. His hands are involved. His hands are part of the warfare of Torah. Says the Chasam Sofer, Hakol Kol Yaakov, when the voice is the voice of Yaakov, then v'hayadayim yidei Esav. Yaakov Avinu takes away the yidei Esav through his hands, involved in learning. Now Esav can't pick up the gun, can't pick up the knife, can't pick up the weapon to attack. We co-opt, we hijack, we steal the yidei Esav. Hakol Kol Yaakov v'hayadayim yidei Esav. So Chasam Sofer says, where is there a source that hands play a role in learning? We know Kol Yaakov, who says that hands are involved in learning. He says like this. There's a Gemara Makos. The Gemara Makos says in Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis, in Parshas of Zois HaBracha, Moshe Rabbeinu gives a bracha to Reuven. He says, Yechi Reuven v'al Yamois v'zois liYuda v'yoymar. Back to back, you have Reuven and Yehuda. And the Gemara wants to know, in Makos, what's the connection between Reuven and Yehuda? Says the Gemara, the 40 years that Klal Yisrael were in the Midbar, the bones of Yehuda were rolling in his Aron, had no respite, until Moshe Rabbeinu davened. And Moshe Rabbeinu said, who caused Reuven to be moideh for his sin? Yehuda. When Yehuda said, Tzadka mimeni, and he was moideh, Reuven was moideh on his sin. So therefore Hashem forgive Yehuda, because Yehuda made a condition. Yehuda said, if I don't bring Binyamin back, then v'chatasi l'cha kal hayamim. V'chatasi l'cha kal hayamim. But he did bring Binyamin back, says the Gemara. But if somebody says a klala, even on condition, even if the condition is met, the klala is effective in some way, and therefore Yehuda had a tough time getting into the next world. Until Moshe Rabbeinu davened, v'zois li Yehuda. So Moshe davened, Shema Hashem Kol Yehuda. Listen to the voice of Yehuda. So what happened was, at that point, his bones stopped rolling around, and one joint fit into the other. But they still did not let him into the yeshiva shel Mala. So Moshe Rabbeinu davened, V'yal amoy tivienu, bring him to his people. He didn't know how to ask and answer. Moshe Rabbeinu davened. Listen to the pasuk. V'zois Yehuda v'yoymar Shema Hashem Kol Yehuda v'yal amoy tivienu yadav rav loyi. Moshe said, even once they let him into the yeshiva, but he wasn't involved. He couldn't go back and forth. So Moshe davened, Yadav Rav Lai. His hands should be strong. What do you mean his hands should be strong? You should say his mind should be strong. His mouth should be strong. Why is the way to daven for someone to enter the yeshiva shel Mala Yadav Rav Lai? Says the Chasam Sofer, you see from here that the full expression of learning is not realized until your hands are involved. Yadav Rav Lai. So therefore, when the pasuk says Hakol Kol Yaakov v'hayadayim yidei Esav, it doesn't just mean when we learn with our kol, Esav puts down his hands. It means when we learn with our kol, we take his hands. There's always fighting. There's always punches thrown. The question is, where is it going to be? Is it going to be from our enemy, or is it going to be in the discussion of learning? So by the way, going back to the first pasuk, there are many ways of learning this pasuk. One way is like Rashi learned, that it will be reported in the book of God's wars, the miracle he did for us in Arnon. And on the other hand, the Gemara says this is referring to the war of Torah, that those who are involved in the war of Torah, even though they're fighting at first, are loving each other. But these two pshatim are not a contradiction. It's when we're involved in the war of Torah and we end up loving each other, that protects Klal Yisrael. That's why in this instance, the Rebbeinu Shalom saved us from the war of the Amorim, like the Medrash says in Tehillim, that Hashem says to David, you just sit and learn and I will fight your wars. Very similar, the Gemara Makos says on the Pasuk, Oyim dois, Hayu Ragleinu b'Sharayich Yerushalayim. Our legs stood firm in the gates of Yerushalayim. Says the Gemara, Mi garam l'Ragleinu sheyamdu b'Milchama. What allows us to stand firm in war? Share Yerushalayim, the gates of Jerusalem, Shayu Oiskam HaTorah, where we learn Torah. In other words, the key, the success for warfare is if we utilize and max out Milchama and Milchamta Shel Torah, we are Zoicha that the Rebbe Shalom protects us from real Milchama. By the way, one more Gemara, we find that when Doeg told Shaul about David, the pasuk says, and it's Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Tzadi Gimel Beis, Vayan echad mehanaorim, vayomer hine ro'isi ben laishi beis halachmi. That Doeg said about David, Yodea Nagain, he knows how to play music, V'gibar Chayil, he's powerful, V'yish Melchama, V'navain Davar, V'ish Tayar, V'Hashem Imai. Says the Gemara, this whole pasuk was Lashon Hara that Doeg said against David. What does it mean he knows how to play music? He knows how to ask questions. What does it mean he's Gibar? He knows how to answer. What does it mean he's an Ish Melchama? Sheyoidea Lisa Valitein B'Malchamta Shel Torah. So I once heard also from Rabbi Obam, there's a famous machlokes. What's better? To be a baki in Shas, to know everything, but just to be a big yadan, very knowledgeable, have a broad knowledge, or to be an amkan, to know a few things, but to know them to its extreme, to know something deeply. What's better, to be expert in Bekios or expert in Eon? And it's a machlokes. Rav Yosef, the Gemara says, was a Sinai. Sinai refers to knowing the whole corpus of material, to know Kol HaTorah Kula. And Rabbi was an Oiker Harim. Rabbi was able to uproot mountains. That's an expression of being an Amkan. Says the Gemara, it's Tzricha L'Hushaita, they needed him, Shalchu L'Hasam, and they sent a message, Sinai v'Oikar Harim, Eza mehem kaidem. You have a Sinai and an Oikar Harim. Which one is better? The Gemara says Sinai kaidem. Sinai is first. Sha'akol tzrichim l'marichacha. Everybody needs somebody who knows the material. They say humorously, there was a great Bucky in Montreal who was like Talmud of the Rogachover, who they asked him, the Gemara says, who's better, Sinai or Oikar Harim? And the Gemara says Sinai is better. So they asked, well, why is Sinai better? What's an Oikar Harim? Oikar Harim is going to uproot the mountain. So let him come and uproot Sinai. Sinai is a mountain. So let the Oikar Harim uproot. So he said as a joke, yeah, of course he could uproot the mountain. The problem is he only knows one thing, so he can't find where Sinai is. He doesn't know where it is. But anyway, according to what we're learning, it's interesting. What do we call somebody who knows Torah very deeply? Uprooter of mountain. Why is that an expression used to refer to someone who knows Torah very well? Because according to the way we're putting these psukim together, we're saying in the Zechus that Klal Yisrael were involved in Melchamta Shel Torah. Hashem waged their war. What war? How did Hashem wage the war? Hashem took the mountain of Eretz Yisrael, He uprooted it, and He smashed it against the mountain of Moav. So, as an expression of someone who is a very big bucky in Torah, we call him Oiker Harim. He could uproot a mountain. Where do we find someone who knows who could uproot a mountain? Right here, in the Zechus of at first they're Nasim Oyevim, Ulavasayf Nasim Oyhavim. In the Zechus of that, this person, Klal Yisrael, were Oiker Harim, and the Rebbe Shalom performed the great miracle in the Nachal Arnon. Okay, I wish everybody a wonderful day.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.